My name is Spencer Lorman. I am the NGA account manager for Geospatial Solutions. We are the ENVI IDL people, amongst other things. The reason we're starting this for a couple of reasons. One, to keep everybody in the loop with comments to, and just, while we're not in our, we have hopefully we can help you guys out with any problems you're having online or while you're at home. So we just wanted to do this as something to say, hey, we're still working on improving ENVI. We're still interested in your problems. We're still trying to make sure that whatever problems you have, we can help you to identify and answer. So this is the first of an ongoing series of webinars that we'll be hosting every other week. So the next one will be on April 22nd. You should receive an email, or well, you should, with the invite that was sent out, have received, there's a link on that that says add to calendar. So that should add all the events to your calendar. So in any case, these will be every other week. Going kind of displaying everything that do in ENVI and what D&I customers are interested in using ENVI to do. So without further ado, I will hand it over to James Lewis, who is our lead solutions engineer, who is going to be driving these presentations for the most part. Yeah, James, take it away.
All right, thank you, Spencer. Hopefully everyone can see the slides. I apologize, as we all are probably working from home. So I'm on a single screen. So every now and then you may see me switch back and forth between the presentation and just making sure that I am able to see any questions that may pop up. So I apologize for that ahead of time. So hopefully everyone can see the agenda slide, and this will give you guys kind of an idea of what we'll be going over today. And I like to, kind of echo, Spencer, thank everyone for taking time out today. I mean, I know we all have so much to do being at home. So we'll do some quick introductions. You've kind of already heard Spencer. He gave you a little bit of mine over that. We'll look at what's new in ENVI. For some of you who may be on this call, you may have used ENVI years ago. You may have used it even a year ago, and quite a bit has changed. So all of our presentations will kind of start off with a what's new. What I will say about this what's new intro is that it will not be the end-to-end what's new. We're going to save that for ENVI as an ELT, which is the next session that we'll be having. But this will give you all kind of an idea of what to expect when we go into that webinar, as Spencer mentioned, in the next 2 weeks. And then we'll get down to business on what we really came here to talk about, which is the ENVI Modeler. I think this is the biggest leap forward in how people have interacted with ENVI in a really long time. Because if you understand ENVI, it started out as IDL, and then ENVI grew from IDL into kind of the GUI-based ENVI, and now really trying to introduce ENVI into a new set of users who may not have the time to learn traditional coding initially, but know that they want to create efficiencies and workflows on their own without always having to go to those expertise, if those expertise even exist on a team or within their sections that they work in. So we'll do, once we kind of go through some slides, we'll come out and I will take you guys through kind of a quick walkthrough of ENVI itself. Again, nothing as robust as what we'll go through in the next 2 weeks for the ENVI as an ELT, but just a quick orientation to ENVI itself. And then we'll briefly kind of walk through building a very basic model. Hopefully everyone got the download data link and materials. That is for you all to go through a couple of exercises. I apologize ahead of time. One of those exercises is one that requires you to have Sarscape. So unfortunately, you won't be able to do that one, but I did include additional models for you all to run through, see how they work. And then additionally, we are uploading.
Currently. Hey, James, seems like we may have lost audio. for
Oh,
a few users.
okay.
So just hold on.
Are you able to see messages?
Yeah,
Hi,
I'm
James.
seeing
I can
messages.
still hear you audio. I'm on the phone and I can see your screen, so it looks great.
Okay.
Yeah, but there's probably like 10 or so people that can't hear you. Are you calling in from your phone, James?
I'm going through I'm doing everything
web?
through the web. Yep.
Web. Okay. It's weird that some people can't hear you. Oh, people
Yeah,
are
I'm wondering.
now can hear you.
Okay.
The phone. Okay.
And I'm on the phone, so I dialed in and I'm not using the computer for audio.
Okay.
Yeah, I dialed in through my phone. I can hear you.
Yeah, I dialed in as well.
Okay. So is everyone good now?
Yeah.
Okay, so again, we'll go through some introductions just in case those that were having some audio troubles can hear me. We'll go through some quick introductions. We'll go through a couple of slides about what's new in ENVI. Again, not the full in-depth of what's new, but I kind of chose some key things that I think those of you that have not used ENVI in a while will be pleased to know. And then again, our focus for this particular webinar will be ENVI Modeler. So really bringing the power of ENVI's robust API into the hands of users that need to get up and running as quickly as possible, but creating their own workflows and their own tool sets. So then we'll do a quick walkthrough. Again, not of a very robust workflow, but again, orient you all to the new ENVI, orient you to the modeler, and then you all should have gotten a download link within your invite that allows you to download a couple of pre-built models. And there was also a PDF with some more robust walkthrough examples. And again, I apologize for one of those examples, which is one that involves SAR tools. So unless you're on a system that has that, you won't be able to do that one. But I included some additional.
Will now be recorded.
Someone's on echo.
That I think is me. Sorry.
Okay. And then I've included, once everyone is comfortable, after you've completed those exercises, what I've also included is a build your own data set over Denver, Colorado. It's from Damos 2, panchromatic and multispectral data set. No instructions for that, but the goal is for you all to really take what you've learned through this webinar, take what you've learned through the hands-on materials that you've been provided, and then really begin to tinker around with the modeler so that you can see the strengths and weaknesses. It won't, if you're a hardcore down and dirty scripter, it may not be exactly what you want, but I can tell you through experience of talking to those types of people, it is a really awesome way to quickly prototype versus sitting there and spending hours or days writing lines and lines of code. You can quickly take things and just see if it even works, right? So and then we'll have some time on the back end, 10 minutes or so for any questions. But what I will say is that Spencer will be monitoring the messages. So if anyone has any questions while we are going through the presentation, please don't hesitate to ask. I'd rather you ask while it's fresh on your mind than try to wait to the end of the webinar and your question I get. There will be a slide with points of contact. So again, if anything comes up after this or after you've gone through the materials, definitely feel free to reach out to any of us. So with that, Spencer, do you want to introduce yourself again?
Yeah, so just for those that have dialed in, my name is Spencer Warman. I'm the NGA Harris Geospatial Resolution and Solutions account manager. I'm glad to see a few familiar names on here. And I'm actually really excited that we're able to do this for you guys because it's helping me pass the time in my day. So hopefully you guys learn quite a bit about new functionality in ENVI, and hopefully we're able to start answer any of your questions.
All right, thank you, Spencer. And I'm James Lewis. So I'm a lead solutions engineer. So what does that really mean? I'm the guy that helps you guys solve problems. I'm also your voice of customer back to the company. So when you all have function requests or there's things that the software isn't doing, I'm the person that will take those things back and do my best to get them in the product. I'm proud to say that a lot of what you will see in what's new, particularly any of you that have not touched ENVI in a couple of years, I would say about 98% of what is in the product now is all from voice of customer. So I say that to say that we do listen to the things. Again, you may not get everything when you ask for it, but I want you all to know that we definitely do listen, and we try to get those things in as quick as possible. My background is geospatial. I was on the combat arms side of things for 5 years. I was a long range reconnaissance guy, then switched over to geospatial, 14 years on active duty, now transferring into the reserves. So been doing this stuff for a while, and definitely help you guys see the usability of this. All right, so for those not familiar with ENVI, ENVI is kind of the leader in image science. For some, that has been what they felt as difficult because they thought, oh, it's all this hyperspectral stuff. I don't use hyperspectral. But I think over the next couple of weeks, as we go through these webinars, I definitely think you will see that ENVI is a lot more than just a hyperspectral tool. ENVI is truly a very capable ELT. However, we will not leave behind that lineage that we have in the spectral space. But we want to ensure that we cover a wide spectrum, no pun intended there, of usability for all of our customers. So from this webinar about the modeler, which is really trying to introduce people into more of a GUI-based scripting, to continuing to add functionality to IDL, and adding in more of that robust ELT functionality for more of our analysts. So we'll start the webinar off with some what's new. So this what's new, these couple of what's new slides will cover really from about 5.5.1, even though I say 5.5.2 there, about 5.5.1 up to our latest release version of 5.5.3. Most of you, if not all of you, depending on who you work for and where you are, should either have a temporary license that was provided to you, or if you are Marine Corps, NGA, or Army, D6 users, you should have taken advantage of home use. If not, at the end of this presentation, I will go through how to request your home use license if you're one of those users. For everyone else, you will be provided those temporary licenses. So those of you that might not know, ENVI has had a long history with sensor support. We were owned by Kodak, for those of you that might not have known, and Kodak, since the beginning of things going up into space, particularly with their background in cameras and lenses, have built a lot of the mirrors and glass for a lot of those sensors that are up there. And to this day, that continues out of Rochester, New York. So we are usually pretty much on the forefront of supporting sensors. And I know some people are going to kind of snicker when you see Worldview 4 there. You know, a year or two ago, it had some gyro issues, but there is still Worldview data, Worldview 4 data that came down before it went all funky. So, but we support all of the worldviews, ADS-80, which is a Leica-based airborne sensor. So we try to stay on top of that. This next slide, again, just some more sensors that we support. I think the biggest takeaway from this slide, if you notice in the lower right-hand corner, is the planet scope reflectance data. Since the concept of Planet, we've been able to support their data, but initially Planet wasn't providing any of their reflectance data. They were just providing kind of the RGB data. And since they've started doing that, we now also support that reflectance data as well. And again, if you're on the DNI side, you should have access to that data, that Planet scope small sat data. Another thing we've continued to do is, again, minimize that cost of entry into exploiting those data sets. And we've done that by doing something called our spectral indices. So if you think of spectral indices, they're basically band math equations to do something with your data. And so what we've done is we've created a whole library of these spectral indices within the software. And they're intelligent enough that when you upload a data set, the indices will inspect your data set to see what bands you have available. And it will only display the indices that will work with your data set. So if you have a 4-band image with particular wavelengths in it, instead of having to go through all of these indices, it will only display the indices that would work with those available bands that you have in your data set. Another thing we've done outside of this kind of IDL widget browser, we know that there is endless repositories of data. And one of the more frustrating things for someone who has to go to a bunch of different databases or web pages to download data is when you're in a piece of software and you have to learn an entirely different interface outside of that data provider's interface. And so what we did was to break down for that. If everyone could mute their mics until they have a question. Appreciate it. Thank you. Is being able to download that data all in kind of one streamlined process, right? So what does that look like? So we have this kind of native support for Grid. And for those of you on the phone who don't know about Grid, that Grid is a kind of all things elevation and point cloud related repository of data at all of the enclaves. So unclass all the way up. But in previous years, when we wanted to interact with that, we would just use the Grid API, build our own interface. So from a user standpoint, again, that can be a little frustrating because I now have to learn a different search. I have to learn a different way of downloading the data. And so what we wanted to do is, again, break down those walls to doing that. So our web data browser, essentially, we basically built a web browser. But what that web browser does is allows you to stay within one interface. So from using your already existing login credentials to searching for your data in an interface you're already comfortable searching in. But the kicker to that is you'll notice that kind of in this upper right hand corner, you'll see that ENVI downloads. So instead of going to your default Windows download manager, it actually goes into the ENVI download manager. So now, as soon as you find your data and you extract that data, in this case, it's point cloud data. So you notice that it says open in ENVI LiDAR. So immediately, once I find that data and I click that button, instead of having to, go out, search to where it downloads, unpack it, it's already set up and ready to go. So as soon as you click that open in ENVI LiDAR, that data already begins ingesting and processing for you to go. And it's the same thing with imagery. So if it's imagery, you get it. Out of the box, you'll notice that on the left-hand side, we already input a couple of common ones like NASA Earth data, OpenTopo, which is open source free LiDAR data, Sentinel for SAR data, and some RGB products or some spectral products there as well. And then USGS Earth Explorer, you do have the ability to add in more. And again, we'll look at some of these things more in depth when we do the web ENVI as a ELT webinar. Me4Native is the newest standard for motion imagery. So ENVI today already supports that. We will be continuing to add in more robust support of those data sets. And again, if anyone has specific questions about those, we can take those offline. You can send those to Spencer. And for those that work in places where we can't have certain conversations over the phone, again, we can facilitate those conversations as well. We're going to start tiptoeing in kind of this ENVI task. You'll hear ENVI task talked about a lot. There's a dedicated webinar to them. They're a key component to the modeler. And so what it's saying that we're continuously bringing those tasks and creating more and more tasks. And we'll talk about a little more in depth in a couple of slides about what those are and why they're important. For my geospatial people, we have a whole new topographic shading tool. And no, this movie that's playing is not magic. It is literally about that fast to load in an elevation data set and run these processes. So really to go behind this workflow outside of the singular workflows is that, again, keeping you in one interface, but where you can do multiple things to a single data set. So if I wanted to see a shaded relief with some type of stretch, a specific type of presentation of the colors, I could do all that in one interface versus running each one of these things through a separate workflow. Another thing we've added in is direct connection to the open source OpenStreetMaps. So if you have connectivity, then you can run it. It'll go out to the open source. The beautiful part about this is everything comes in as a shapefile, already attributed. It will automatically search based off the extents of your imagery, or you can set your own dimensions. And then you just check some boxes. And again, these things will be demonstrated when we do the ENVI as a ELT demo in 2 weeks. And probably one of the biggest things that is available in our 553 is as more and more people are starting to see ENVI as the ELT, there are things that they want to be able to do. And so one of those things is disseminating some of those products out. Let me caveat that by saying that we've always had the ability to kind of like export to PowerPoint. We've been able to, drop annotations. Now, what some people will say, but they weren't really up to snuff of maybe some other tools that you've used. So what we did was went back to the drawing board, and I would say we've kind of knocked this thing out of the park now. So we made a ton of improvements to our annotations, to our report generations. So our export out to PowerPoint. So we've added in like a new image magnifier. We've now added in a little metadata panel that highlights down in the lower right-hand corner of your ENVI. And again, we'll see some of these things when we do our walkthrough of the modeler. But these things are here and available for you to use. Aren't any additional things you have to install, don't require a license. They're just in the software itself. And of course, that PowerPoint generation ability. How many times maybe you sat in a brief and you're like, wow, that's a really nice PowerPoint template, but I'd like to have my own elements that go into things within that layout. So our PowerPoint importer doesn't care about the template. What we'll take is that raw PowerPoint slide, and then you can create your own template within ENVI from that. But you get to choose what those elements become. So whether it's imagery, whether it's a map, whatever the case may be, and you actually can assign those things through this PowerPoint importer. So that's pretty sweet. And then, as always, we've had a long history and relationship with Esri. For those of you that work at NGA, myself and Spencer, along with Esri, did a joint webinar in December. We will be doing, again, another one in this webinar series, but highlighting some of this integration. So we'll briefly talk about that because the modeler also helps facilitate some of that integration. And then for all of that to work, it's no charge. You simply need something called ENVI Pi. Our latest version is 1.3.1 for desktop or for pro. We can make that available to you. This is kind of all of the backend Python libraries that allow that integration to work. And one other thing that we will be doing a webinar on, which again is now actually part of our home use license, is the ENVI Deep Learning module. This is really taking some of the complications out of and the complexities of doing deep learning and really bringing it down to analyst-friendly level. So utilizing tools that are already in ENVI, or bringing in like some OpenStreetMap layers and then applying those to you. So again, a deeper webinar on this, but again, this is more so just kind of for situational awareness that these things exist. And again, this is a part of our home use license. So with that, are there any questions over anything, what's new, before we move on? All right. So presenting the ENVI Modeler. So there's a couple of objectives that we want to kind of cover while we're here. So for some people, what is the ENVI Modeler? Again, when people traditionally think of ENVI, the last thing I'm pretty sure they think of is a modeler. They think of hyperspectral. Wow, yeah, I do hyperspectral. And if we really think about the amount of the community that's really exploiting hyperspectral, composed to those of us who use everything from panchromatic and MSI. There's a huge difference there. So we'll talk about kind of what the modeler is. Why should we even care about using the modeler? And then what kind of applications is it good for? Because again, it's good for some things and may not be as suited for others. So we'll kind of discuss some of those as we go on. So earlier you saw a slide about task. And so out of the box, ENVI ships with over 240 pre-built tasks. So if anyone on the phone is an old classic IDL user or ENVI Classic user, we previously had something called DOITs. And a DOIT is exactly what it sounds like. It is a couple of lines of codes that do something. So in the case of doing dark object subtraction, you had a dark object subtraction DOIT that ran dark object subtraction. The downside to the DOITs were, if we think about now, the size of data that's coming down, the amount of data that's coming down, a lot of people are beginning to move their analysis to the enterprise. Everyone is moving things to the cloud, right? So with DOITs, if at some point you had wrote a really cool workflow that worked awesomely on the desktop and you want to say, hey, I want to now run this on a server or throw it in the cloud, you would have literally had to rewrite that. Task now minimize that cost of entry of moving things to the enterprise and the cloud. So basically you can move tools when you're ready to move. You build it once, and that same tool that runs on the desktop can be run on the enterprise or ran out in the cloud. Now, granted, there are some, you need some other pieces of ENVI to do that, which we'll discuss in some other webinars. But the beautiful part of that, it's just from an operational standpoint, is you cut down that time of having to recreate a tool to support, a different type of mission, right? So it takes advantage of all the API. They're extensible. I mean, you can create your own task. So we give you over 240 out of the box, but you can create your own task. And so one of those webinars will be on how to build tasks and how to take maybe some pre-built IDL tools and wrap those in tasks. Again, the beautiful thing about IDL is super, super flexible. So if you have C++ code or some Java code, ENVI is very flexible in the code that it can deal with. Python, we're going to do a dedicated one on Python as well. But the reason we're talking about task is because once it's a task, it is accessible to the modeler. So the modeler's whole being is because of task. So that brings us here to the ENVI Modeler. So modeler is nothing more than visual programming, right? So if you think about IDL, you have the IDL workbench, it's lines of code and someone is sitting there. Or if you're doing Python and you're in Jupyter Notebook, right? And you're writing out your line of code. Awesome for someone who has the time to learn how to do that code. But for people who say, I understand imagery a little bit, I kind of know what I want to do, I don't want to have to write those lines of code to do that, the modeler's perfect for that. Or if you are someone who likes writing code, but just wants to quickly prototype, the modeler is also awesome for that. I have people who have been, written in IDL and, other languages for years, and they'll consistently hit me like, man, the modeler was a time saver because before I spent time writing those lines of code, I just quickly threw it in a model and found out that, it was work. Another beautiful thing about the modeler is because it is taking advantage of tasks, you notice you will not take a performance hit. So we don't use a different version of the task. So whether I'm someone who writes straight scripts or I'm someone who uses the modeler, that task is the exact same task, meaning that all of the parameters that you have access to within the script, you would have those same parameters accessible within the modeler. And again, we'll see some of that. So you can build workflows without any knowledge of ENVI programming. Now, you still have to understand the processes that you're doing to the imagery. It doesn't solve that. But if you understand that, then now we've minimized, again, that cost of entry into building out your own workflows. Batch process. One thing that if you wanted to batch process in ENVI in years past, you had to write code to do that. The modeler takes that out of the way. If you have something called our Geospatial Services Framework, which is kind of our enterprise cloud enablement of ENVI, you can actually kick these processes off on the server or in the cloud. And we've done these things before. So build a tool on your desktop, test it, it runs, but then if the data, you basically can process data at rest. So instead of pulling data to your desktop, that data could stay on the server where the GSF is. You click off your tool, it runs from your desktop, sends the request out to the server, it processes all that data on the server, and then all you do is have it display back the output on your desktop, or you have it dump into a folder. So pretty powerful in that. Another thing that it does for you is if you do want the script, it will generate the IDL and the Python code for you. So with the click of a button, and again, we'll go through these things so you can kind of see them. And it's another way to put custom workflows within the Esri platform. So you can either run individual tasks directly from Arc or Pro, or you can create a workflow here. And what it will do is it will create that script, and then you just add that script or that task to your Arc Pro. And we'll see how that works here in a couple of slides. So really, another advantage of the modeler is filling the gap between the user interface and API. What we traditionally think of is workflows and toolboxes. Workflow is streamlined, minimizes my need to know things, but it's a black box. It's pretty locked down. I don't have a lot of flexibility in that. Toolbox gives me a little more flexibility, but if I've never used a specific piece of software before, a toolbox can be kind of confusing. So it's easy to use because I can see everything I want, but it's not very flexible because I have to kind of figure out what do I need. Next thing is the application interface, or the API, which again, if I don't have a background in scripting, then API can be scary, but it's super powerful because I can make that piece of software do basically what I want it to do. So the modeler kind of gets us in the middle because I have access to the power of the API, but I have the ability to create workflows that I could then add to my toolbox or run as just a standalone model, and I can share those things out. So again, that awesome flexibility of the API by having all access to all of the parameters of a particular tool versus a workflow that may be using that same tool, but because it's in a workflow, I may have stripped out some of the parameters that I didn't think users would need. So I know someone's thinking, okay, that's cool, James, but how do I chain processes together? How do I what if I have multiple things that I want to put into my model, and I want that as a single tool that I call from Arc, or I want it just in a toolbox? That's where we get into what we call meta task. So when you think of meta task, my little Lego guy over here, we have like a API call. So in this case, it's going to be ISO data, and that's the one we will use as an example. But there's additional parts to doing a classification image. So there's clumping, there's sieving, there's smoothing. And each one of those things is its own individual task. So once we begin to chain those things together, that is what we call a meta task. So think of a meta task. Task are individual API calls. A meta task is those multiple API calls that are chained together. It's the only difference. And again, you don't take that performance hit even when you save it out as IDL, or you save it to a script, or you make it a tool. Why? Because underneath that, it is the exact same task framework. That is the exact same task framework that ENVI as a desktop is using. So the modeler gets to take advantage of those exact same tools. So whether I'm running it as a model or as a standalone ENVI script, you would notice no difference in that running because it's the same API calls. It's just one is GUI based and one is your more traditional scripting. Do we have any questions up to this point? All right. So there's some basic terms as we go through the modeler. Again, if you've used ArcGIS as modeler or a modeler and some other pieces of software, some of these terms may be pretty familiar to you. Some may not, but for the sake of, again, everyone, we'll just kind of go over these. So we'll talk about, the nodes. Again, we'll go a little more meta tasks, connectors, breakpoints, aggregator, and the different iterator nodes, and then tasks themselves. So a node is just a basic, a single call for the model, right? It's a node. So that node could be input data, it could be an iterator, it could be a filter, but it's just that single thing. So it's just that input data, that task, that single thing that you put there. Connector is self-explanatory. It is what connects one or more nodes together. Meta task, again, is those chained API processes together into one thing. So that's what builds a meta task. Think of breakpoints as exactly what they are. They're basically stopping points within your model. So if you've ever used IDL itself or other scripting languages, you usually can put breakpoints in so that your script will run up to a certain point. Well, we've done that graphically. So you have that same exact capability, but in the modeler to put those breakpoints in. We now have added in a filter iterator. So this is like adding if statements. So you can add conditional statements in now. If you've used the older version of the modeler, that wasn't in there. So this is new as of 5.5.2. So if you have at least 5.5.2, you should see this filter iterator. So, and we'll talk about kind of what that is. We have just a iterator. So this gives you that ability to batch process through files, and just pull all those files. And then aggregator is if I need to pull, add things to multiple data items. So like in an array, I need to, I'm doing some band stacking and I need to add those different things in there. So by the end of this, you should have a deeper understanding of how to build workflow models, looking at how to use different types of nodes, how to extract metadata, adding breakpoints, adding outputs into your data manager or displaying it in your ENVI. And then we'll talk about what the validate, the run, and importing items into a model are. So nodes and connectors, right? That's the core of every model. So in this example, we can see some different input parameters. It's querying the spectral indices and then filling that in and pushing it out to the indices. And in this case, it wants to go to the data manager. And within ENVI, when you think about the data manager, that is basically the repository of everything you've opened during your current ENVI working session. So whether you're displaying it or not, it resides in your data manager until you fully close out ENVI. And then your view is, of course, that open ENVI session that you're actually looking at. So there's a bunch of different nodes that you can pull in because, again, nodes can be the APIs, but then you also have the default nodes, which we'll take a look at a little more later. So we can do things like bring in individual files. So file would be a hard-coded thing. Like I have one file or 2 or 3 files, and I want to bring it in. Data set, you could bring in things that are already sitting either in your ENVI, or you can point to, or if you want to point to like a folder of things, then you can use file. It has the ability to bring in other things. Input parameters allow you to pull specific things out of that data set that may need to go into a specific node. So if a spectral node you're running requires a specific band, input parameters will allow you to say, hey, this input parameter goes to this. And again, some of these things will make more sense when we actually look at the live models. Aggregator takes multiple data items and then adds them. So again, for batch processing. Task is that specific ENVI task. Again, data manager is what holds your working data. So again, whether you have it loaded or not, if you've opened it in your current working session, it would reside in your data manager. And then view is exactly what we're working in. So when you go into the modeler and we open it up, you have some basic nodes. So these basic nodes will always be displayed. So this is your file, your data set, array of values, your data manager, things like that. When you click on file, you notice that it gives you the option to load in any of these different file types. So type points, spectral library, a point cloud, raster, series, vector, and so on. So once you click that, it allows you to go and find that data or those multiple data files and bring those in. Then if you go down just below that, you're going to have all of the tasks. So when you first power up the modeler, which we'll see, it takes a second because it has to scan and query for all of the out of the box tasks and any custom task that you may have added into your ENVI session. And I'll show you guys some examples of what custom tasks look like. So you can either double click or you can just grab and drag. Another thing that we've now added is the ability to tag. So let's say I don't need every single task. I just want tasks that have to do with classification. I can now search by that specific tag or by classification, and it will only display either things that are just spectral, so only tasks that correspond to spectral, or only things that would have to do with like classification. So you have a lot of different ways versus, you know, searching through all of these tasks. You can actually look for very specific things. And if you think about a meta task, again, as you visualize it as a model, it looks like a workflow. But if you wanted to hand this off to someone or get it into Arc, because I know someone's asking, oh, that's cool. Because you guys have that integration, can I just take my ENVI model and add it into my ArcGIS model? Model to model, the answer is no. But what you can do is take your ENVI model, save it out as a meta task, and what it will then do is create the meta task. And once that meta task has been created, you can then add that into your ArcGIS model because Arc will see it as an ENVI tool. Now, you do have to have, I guess I probably should have said that up front, you do still have to have an ENVI license available for Arc to take advantage of those tools. So like, let's say you get the ENVI Pi from someone. The ENVI Pi does not have a license. It doesn't require a license. But as soon as you get a model and you try to run it, if you don't have the same licenses that meta task was produced from, an example, Army and Marine Corps, even though ENVI is baseline on both of their geospatial systems, they have some different licensings. So if an Army DXCX geospatial user built a model that had access to, say, IDL, and then they gave it to that Marine, and the Marines don't have that IDL license, that part of the model will not work. So just want to make sure I'm aware of that. So the integration is free, does not require a license, but if you have to call any of those ENVI processes, because all of that's running under the hood, it still has to have access to an ENVI license. So again, the meta task process is taking your chain of individual nodes and individual tasks and then stringing those together. And that is how we can either run it as a single standalone model. But if you don't want to, maybe you say, hey, I don't want to confuse people, I don't want them to see all of my nodes, you can save that out as a meta task and then just run it as a single tool. But all of those tasks will be combined into that meta task. The next node that is important is input parameters. So in that lower left hand corner, you can see that I have this MSI image. I'm running an ISO data classification. And so from that, there may be very specific parameters that ISO data tool requires. So I have to utilize the input parameters so that I can pull those specific things out of that data set. And again, once we see these things kind of run, it'll make a little sense. The next one is kind of a iterator node, and there's now two different types of iterator modes. So there's just the iterator, which is one of the basic nodes, and you also have the filter iterator. The difference between the two is the iterator is just going to take your data as is. The filter iterator will allow you, again, to put customized statements about a data set. So let's say I want data that has a specific band in it, but not this other band. The filter iterator allows you to set that type of rule up. So those if statements. So if my data has this, but not that, run through. And we have examples of those within the help and things like that. So we have aggregator. So I can take a collection of things and feed them in as array. So if I have a big stack of data that I want to feed into a process, so in this case, they're doing building a band stack. And after they regridded that data, kind of made all that data like pristine data together, feed it back through the aggregator, and I can fill that back out. Again, data manager is what do I want to happen after my model runs? Do I want it to load into my current ENVI session and then I access it later? In that case, I could dump it into the data manager. That saves me the additional steps of having to go out and find it. Or do I want it to go directly into my view, or I can put it into both? We can also extract metadata or specific properties. So let's say I want, again, specific bands, or I have, I'm making a time series and I want data sets with a specific time component. I would need to extract those properties or that metadata, and we have a node that does that. So again, kind of a visual representation of that. So in this case, we're taking the properties out of this raster set, things like class names, class values, and then you can click. Most of these are pretty smart, so they will kind of figure out what that other node needs. So in this case, this is a support vector SVM classifier. So it kind of knows what properties it will need. The model will alert you to say that, hey, there's no parameters that meet the needs of this data set. So instead of spending time and trying to figure it out, it'll let you know that, hey, your data set doesn't support connecting to this. So there are some kind of smarts and logic built into this. So we can pull stuff from arrays. We can add in breakpoints. So again, remember breakpoints, your model will run up to a specific point. It'll stop. You have the option then to change parameters kind of on the fly. So this is more of that interactive workflow. If not, your model will just run straight through. And then we have here the validate, run, and import. So I have to say that validate, some people think, oh man, it tells me my model's good. No, what validate means is, hey, your model is connected properly. Your parameters line up doesn't mean that the science that you use, like like if you just chain some nodes together, it doesn't mean that that's going to give you the output you expect. What it means is everything lines up the way it should, right? So just remember that. So that's what validate means. It's not necessarily validating your science. It is validating the fact that each one of those nodes has the proper connection that it needs to complete the cycle. So that's what the validate means. You'll notice down here in the lower right hand corner as well, we now have added in the ability for more of those hardcore scripter people or science users. They want to know, well, how long did it take for my model to run? So we now have added in, with the release of 553 or 552 actually, the ability to run in what we call debug mode. So if you notice, it says execution time. So you will actually, as it's running, this little script will be printing out how long it took for those specific parts of your model to run. So every node will give you feedback on how long it took for it to run. So you can see what the bottlenecks are in your model, because you might say, oh man, the IDL one standalone isn't as fast as my IDL and Python one. So I want to switch that out. So all I would do is just create a task for that. And now I insert that in the model. And you can test that theory by, again, running in debug mode. Or if you know everything is good to go, then you just run your model as standalone. A couple of other options that you'll notice here are the ability to generate your IDL program. So this will actually write out your IDL script. And again, I'll show you all of these. Generate your meta task, generate your Python. So a lot of options there. And you also have the ability to save out that debug report once it's done, or copy and paste it. So we give you a lot of flexibility in there and a lot of power within that modeler. I've been talking for a little while. Any questions up to this point? I know we're coming up on our hour, but I want to make sure that if anyone has any questions at this point, we get those answered as best we can. Any questions? All right. So the final part is, before we kind of start clicking around on things, is we'll talk about the Arc integration. So how does that Arc integration work? So if you're an ArcGIS user, you occasionally dabble with ENVI. One of the beautiful things is that we don't force you to have to work in ENVI if you don't need to go there all the time. Now, there may be instances where it's just easier to stay there, but there may be instances where you're like, I open it up every now and then, and I need these 2 or 3 things. So you can either add those things to your ArcGIS as individual tasks, but if you've created a specific workflow that you don't want to have to open up ENVI just to run that workflow, then what you do is bring it in as a task. And then if someone has already written it as a straight up task, then you can skip this step. You just add it, you install ENVI, and then you just add it, it'll create the toolbox. But if someone has created a model, you create this meta task, and you either click a box, so this little interface will come up, and you'll notice that it gives you 2 options. These options, caveat that with saying that, again, particularly any of us that work on DoD systems, it's probably going to be a little hard because it needs certain permissions. So in the case of like checking ArcMap or checking ArcGIS Pro or even ENVI, most of us can't write to like the C drive and things like that. So doesn't mean this won't work for you. So if you have that ability, you check these boxes, it'll automatically add the tool, it'll create the tool, add the tool to your ArcGIS Pro or to your ArcMap or into your ENVI. If you don't have permissions to write to that C drive, then what happens is you'll notice that this location for custom code shows up. And then up top, you have a line for where you name your task. Copy that name. And then when you go into Arc in the dialog box, you would just paste that name in, create your tool, a little script will run, it'll create the tool. And then you right click, add a new tool to Arc. And then that same tool is added there. So again, whether you have permission to write there or not, it does not stop you from adding that tool into ArcGIS. And then here's an example of kind of what that would look like. So in case of Pro, calling ISO data from Pro, the beautiful part about this, it looks like any other ArcGIS workflow. And again, we'll see some more of these when we actually do the webinar for the ArcGIS and ENVI integration. And here's some examples of custom tasks. So again, you're not relegated just to what we provide you out of the box. If there are people creating really cool tools, you can add those as well. A prime example of that is Marine Corps, so Navy Research Lab wrote some bathymetry tools in IDL. The users were not familiar with ENVI, but they were familiar with Arc. And so what we did was help them turn that classic IDL code into task. once they were tasked, we could then just add them to ArcGIS. So they were still able to take advantage of the power of those ENVI tools, but in an interface where they were already comfortable working in. And in addition to making it usable for the end user, they also future-proof that code. Because again, remember, as that legacy IDL code, if at some point in the future they wanted to enterprise or cloud enable that tool, they would have had to totally rewrite that every single time they moved it somewhere. But now as a task, whenever they are ready to make that investment in enterprise or cloud, they just take that tool, drop it on the server, and now it's running in enterprise or it's running in the cloud. So a lot of benefits to task. And like I said, we will have some webinar on how to create those, both from taking some old legacy code and creating one from the ground up. But out of the box, again, these are just some things that you have access to. So within the data and the PDF that you downloaded, there will be some exercises. So it'll be your turn to kind of go through and use some out of the box models. We give you instructions, we help you do it. We've also provided the data for that. I've also, again, given you all a data set with no model for it. That's that build your own data set. It may not have been available. I'll give you a heads up. It is a little over 2 gigs. It's a panchromatic and a multispectral data set of Deimos 2 over Denver. So they had a little trouble getting that uploaded. So you will, if you weren't able to get that or it's not showing yet, we will send out another link so that you all can grab that data set down. So with that, let me, for you, actually bring up ENVI, and I will orient you all to the new ENVI and to the modeler, and we'll step through making a very basic model outside of what you guys have access to on the PDF that you downloaded. So let me start my ENVI up. And while I'm starting ENVI, are there any questions over anything we covered previously? I know it's a fire hose of stuff, and I'm hoping that everyone kind of caught something out of it. But again, please, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Second here, I'm gonna share out my entire screen so everyone can see everything. All right, can everyone see my ENVI screen?
Got it, James.
All
Yeah,
right.
I see him.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So this is the new ENVI. I know some of you immediately are thinking, man, that looks a lot like ArcGIS. And that was done on purpose. What we started seeing within the community is that a lot of people have access to Esri's tools. And so those of us that have been doing this for any period of time, we've definitely built up muscle memory to those Esri tools. Again, particularly for me being from the geospatial side, I dabble back and forth in both worlds. So it's really cool that I don't have to totally learn a new interface. Now, the downside, and Spencer is one of my converts, there are a lot of people who are in love with classic ENVI. I will tell you that classic ENVI, at least for the next couple of years, is not going anywhere. So if you're a classic ENVI faithful, it is still there for you. However, just like Esri, any new functionality that we do will only be going into this newer ENVI interface. So I would highly recommend that if you haven't played around with this, or you played around with it when it was first released, that you revisit it now, because just like Arc Desktop to Pro, I would say at this point we're about 99.9% of what you could do in Classic you can do here. I will caveat that with saying that some things may not be exactly the same. And if you find that, again, Spencer, before he came on board with us, can attest that if you find something is slightly different, let us know. Reach out and let us know, and we'll get you guys, what you need. I mean, we turned around something for Spencer in a previous life in Spencer, like a day?
Yeah, it's pretty quick. We had a an issue with Quack that we were running in Classic that wasn't functioning the same way in new ENVI in the SOAR module. And yeah, like James was saying, it was turned around 24, 36 hours, something like that.
Yeah. And so then what we do is we'll just roll that into the software. So again, I'm not promising that everything you ask for will be that quick, but if it's something that's dire need and it's fairly straightforward, usually we can turn around pretty quick. And I say that to say that we try to do our best to do a 1-for-1 exchange of a do it to a task. And because Classic is all do it, newer ENVI is all based on tasks. So real quick, orienting everyone again that may or may not know about the new ENVI kind of to it. So we have full up. If you remember the old linear toolbox in Classic, it's all here now. So this is expandable. So I can minimize it, I can stretch it out, I can fully detach it. I can search the toolbox. So I know someone's saying, man, that's a lot of stuff, I don't want to go through there. So let's say all I want to do is classification. So you'll notice that as I start typing, everything except things that have to do with classification go away. So makes it real easy to search through, because I've had some people that say, oh man, there's a lot there, I don't want to open. That's fine. If you know what you want to do, just type it in. You also have the ability to create your own folders. So I can create my own favorites folder. I can name that favorites folder. So tools that I use maybe all the time so that you don't have to search for them over and over again, you can add them in. Some examples of some of those custom tasks, you will notice that I also have the ability to add things as extensions. So we'll see, I'll show you kind of what these extensions look like. So extensions are things that you add to ENVI that aren't like executables. So there are tools that are not in the standard toolbox. I highly recommend that if any of you are creating models and you don't trust people to not tinker with your model, to give them extensions. So they can run that, they'll run that same tool, but they have no ability to tinker with anything outside of what you have packaged in that extension. If you give them your raw model, there's no way to lock that model down. If you give them the script, even if you give it to them as a script, there is no way to control what they change in your script. So if you have those types of concerns, I highly recommend you give them an extension, because they can't unpack this extension. Over to the left is our layer manager. So everything that we load up or we dump out of our model will load into this layer manager. So this is just where we can see our bands, we can move files around, anything that's working. This is our view. We have these 3 windows at the bottom, which are customizable. So I can select what shows in these. In each one, I can select a different thing to show in these. Once we load up some data, that new little quick look window will populate down here in the lower right. And then up top is kind of our pretty standard ELT type things, with the addition now of our new chip to PowerPoint tool, which you briefly saw some slides on. And again, we'll go into a little more in depth when we do the ENVI as an ELT. So with that, there's a couple of different ways you can access the modeler from within ENVI. So I'm gonna show you all of the ways. So one way is, if you're at the top of the toolbar, you go up to display, you'll notice that it says ENVI Modeler. So you click that button. For me, it's going to take a second because I got a lot of stuff loaded in here. And my modeler pops up. You also can go over to your toolbox. Type in modeler, and you notice that it shows up here as well. So you have a couple of different ways you can get to your modeler. All right. So as we looked at in the slides, here are those basic nodes. So these are all of the basic nodes that will always show up. These are kind of your starting points. Down below that is where we have any of the tasks. And so you remember I briefly told you that whether it's out of the box task or custom task, you'll notice that there's one here, this bare earth extraction. That's a custom task for a tool that I'm running as an extension on my desktop, but I still have access to that within the modeler. So I show that to say that, again, whether it's your out of the box ones or custom ones, they are all, as long as they are a task, they are accessible to the modeler. Then we have the ability to create a new model. You can open a previous model. If you want to, of course, save your model file out and share that. We have some different ways to view it. So I can center my model. I can do an automatic layout. This is your breakpoints. Turn those on and off. And you can create a task from your model. So this will take that model and turn it into essentially like a meta task or a task. Help. ENVI's help is awesome because it actually installs on your system. So whether you have connectivity or not, you'll always be able to get to the help. Server is if we have access to a GSF server. I do have a movie of this, so if anyone after this call or this webinar actually wants to kind of see how say distributed processing, but kind of server side processing from a model would look. I have a movie that shows, a model from my desktop launching a process, processing out on a server, and then returning me a file. The code button is exactly what it does. It actually writes out the code for me. So it will write my IDL, it'll create my meta task, it'll generate my Python, it will validate my model, or I can just run my model or run my model in debug mode and see how long it takes, again, for each piece of my model to actually run. And then here we have some edit tools. So I can do things like copy, paste nodes, I can align. So again, a lot of stuff here, just kind of ease of use things. Importing my models, importing a new task, importing a meta task, and adding that in. What we'll do is we'll just simply drag and drop these things in. So let's get started. Let's grab that file node and let's just drag that file node. So if everyone has their modeler open, those of you that have ENVI license, again, this will be recorded and you do have access to the materials if you signed up. So don't fret. So within ENVI, we give you a bunch of default data. So I'm gonna select on a raster. So I wanna add a raster in. So you'll notice as soon as I clicked on accepting that node, it automatically went to the exact same default data folder as I've set in my parameters of core ENVI. So within core ENVI, it naturally just kind of defaults. So all of this data you're looking at is data that self-installs on the system whenever you install ENVI. So I'm not going to be able to write here. So like most of us, I won't be able to connect that. So I'm going to go into my documents and find me some more data that I want to use. But if you have the ability, if you're on your home computer or system, or what you could do is we could copy and paste this, grab that QB Boulder data set. So we'll copy that. Okay. Let me just throw it out on my desktop. And that's what I'm going to load. So I don't need these. It loaded in 3 files. I really just need this one. All right. So I now have that MSI file loaded into my modeler. So now let's try some other things here. So let's say I don't want to search through all of these things. Once everyone has that data set loaded or a data set that's on your system, and this is not in that PDF, this is just kind of a quick walkthrough. I click on this little tag and you'll notice that it allows me, we've already built in some predefined tags for things. You also have the ability to tag options. So let's say I only want tag or task that pertain to classification. So once I click that, now only things that deal with classification will be exposed to me. And so what we want to do is I want to do ISO data. I want to do an unsupervised classification. So again, I can either double click it or I can drag and drop it. I can also remove that filter so that now I have access to everything. And let's say I just want to do a down and dirty ISO data. I'm not worried about clumping and sieving or smoothing. I just want to quickly just run through this data set because I just need some outputs. So the next thing we want to do is I don't want to have to load this every time. So I want it to go into my data manager. So grab your data manager node and drag that out. But I also want to see what this looks like once it's completed. So let's bring that out and drop it into our view. So what we'll do is we'll connect our data set into ISO data. If I want to change any parameters, I can just click into those little dash lines. So I see that clearly I made a good connection because I see my QB Boulder MSI. I can choose the number of classes. I can change my threshold. How many iterations or times do I want it to run through? And at this point, I have the option to save it out to use somewhere else, or it'll default and give it a name, throw it in my temp. And like everything else, it has direct connectivity to the help. So one of the things that's frustrating about a lot of tools is when you click on help, it just takes you to the default kind of help and you got to search through. And if you don't type things right, you can't find it. But you'll notice that for this particular task, it took me directly to everything about that task. And then if I want more information, I can either click read more, or I can go straight to the source of this, which is directly in our main help. But again, it's really about that efficiency and minimizing the pain to find those things. So if I'm happy with everything, I click OK. We'll make a connection to the data manager. So what it's going to do is once it finishes running, it's going to dump it in here. The output classification will go into our data manager. But I also want to see it directly in the view. So I want it to pop up in my main window once it's done running. So has everyone made these connections? So the file node, go down in the task window and search for ISO data classification. And again, either double click or drag and drop. Go back to your basic nodes and select your data manager and your view, because we want to, again, store it in our current working session. And after it's completed running, rather than have to go and load it manually, I just want it to automatically load into my view. So once that's done, I have a couple of different things that I can do with this. I could either just save this model out and then share this model with somebody, like, hey, I built this really quick ISO data. But I can go in and create the IDL code. So if you go up to code and click that, you'll notice that it basically wrote the script for me. So from here, I can either save this out. I can copy and paste this directly into my IDL workbench. So if I want to learn the code, I can continue doing my work, let this model run. But if I want to learn to write, hardcore tasks and scripts, I can take it this way. I can run it as the script, or I can create the extension. So you'll remember earlier, extensions are tools outside of the standard ENVI tools. The beautiful part about extensions are, for the most part, they shouldn't break any accreditation because they're not executables. They don't have to reside on the C drive. So that's another update I got them to make a couple of years back, because again, for any of us on the DoD side, it is impossible to drop things on your C drive. So now you can go through preferences and point to where you store your extensions. And so when ENVI powers up, ENVI will search that repository to see if any extensions exist. And again, if you don't trust people to not muck around with your model, I would highly recommend that you give them the extension. Again, they'll have access to all of the same parameters. They just won't be able to go in and change anything. So I have the option to generate my meta task, which a meta task is basically, if I had multiple things, it would chain those all together. Or I can write my Python. So you'll notice that it created my Python code. So we can definitely see the difference in IDL versus Python. A lot more lines of code to do the exact same thing. But again, we'll do a whole webinar on integrating the two. And I could run it as a straight up Python code. Validate my model. So again, validating my model just says, hey, James, you know what? All your connections are right. There's no warnings. Everything lines up. Everything is good. Doesn't tell me that what I connected was right. It just tells me that this data set's inputs into this, what this task requires, are connected properly. So that's all validation does. So once I do that, if I wanted to run in debug mode and say, hey, I want to see how long it takes. So you'll notice that as it's running, it took like 0.6 seconds to actually start that task up. Actual total time was 7.2 seconds to actually run the actual ISO data. Then it ran to my task manager. Because we had a view, you'll notice that it loaded in your view. So it should have loaded into your view. But that classification image is also now in my data manager. And you will notice now that in 553, we've added an ability. So now I have that little quick look metadata window down here where the toolbox was. All right, so we're slightly over our hour. Are there any questions as to the modeler, the new ENVI interface? I'll click and go here. Any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a mic and ask a question. Or
those that might be too shy or if don't want to speak up on the call, feel free to email James or myself. I provided James's email towards the beginning of this session today. I can share it out again.
Yep.
And then I got a question from Brandon.
Oh, you have a question?
Yeah. So the link to the recorded webinar will be shared out to all the registered attendees. I'm not sure if Jody is on still. Maybe she can answer that. I'm not sure when that will go out, but it will be shared out via email.
Yep. Any other questions?
And James, I presume the slides will go out with that email as well.
Yes, we will make the slides available along with the webinar. Yep.
And Claire says, thanks so much, especially appreciated the gifts.
Yep.
Well done there, James.
So with that, here are some key points of contact for DNI. This is pretty much a bulk of the DNI team. So Jeff Hildebrandt, he's our defense intel. He's the main manager, but he also handles Army. So if you're a Army D6A user and want to take advantage of the home use program, he is the person you would reach out to. You also see Spencer's information there as well. So if you're a NGA or US government employee and you want to take advantage of home use program, please shoot him an email. You'll notice a gentleman at the bottom by the name of Fabio Vargas. He handles Navy, Marine Corps, and SOF. So if you fall in any of those buckets and want to take advantage of home use, the home use is a 1-year license of ENVI. I'll briefly bring up the sheet. I'm working to update that before we send that out, but we'll send that out to the attendees, or actually get in contact with your account manager and they can send that out to you. You see my contact info there. If you guys have any technical questions or you can't get in contact with one of these gentlemen to the left, you can reach out to me. For the most part, everyone except for Jeff and Tim Mack, Tim Max, another GeoInter imagery warrant that just came onto the team a couple of months ago. He sits down at Fort Bragg. But again, if you can't reach one of us, we all talk to each other at some point, probably at least daily. Myself and Spencer also have NGA accounts. So any of you that are NGA or US government that need to communicate about things at a higher classification level, you can ping us on our unclass and we can get you that contact information as well. So with that, going once, going twice, any last questions, comments?
Thanks everybody for attending. We'll see you guys in a couple weeks.
Yep. Thank you.